Luke and I negate the resolution. Our sole contention is geopolitics. The United Nations contextualizes that the basis for modern international space law is the Outer Space Treaty, a legally binding multilateral agreement ratified by 112 nations in 1967, including India, the US, Russia, and China. Gross 23 explains that the Artemis Accords contradict this framework because they're sponsored by the US as opposed to an international entity. Thus, Bloomberg 23 notes that the Artemis Accords have effectively divided outer space into two spheres of political influence, one led by the US under the Artemis Accords and one led by China under the ILRS, a space agreement co-sponsored by China and Russia in response to the Accords. In the status quo, Rohera 22 explains that India balances relations between the two opposing spheres with a space policy of strategic ambiguity. This means India refuses to officially partner with any one nation's space program. Dubin 23 concludes that signing the Artemis Accords would destroy India's ambiguity by formalizing a bilateral space relationship with the US, sending a geopolitical message to Russia and China that India has chosen to align with the West. India's loss of ambiguity will generate two geopolitical effects. Subpoint A is inciting a regional space competition. Harry 22 contextualizes that currently there is no space race occurring between China and India because the Indian Space and Research Organization focuses primarily on domestic space initiatives. Leah 23 elaborates that signing the Artemis Accords would reverse this trend by switching India's space agenda to an international one led by the US. This is problematic as Whittington 22 reports that China has publicly denounced the Artemis Accords as a deliberate attempt by the US to start a global space race and hamper China's space endeavors. Thus, India's membership would trigger a regional space competition between China and India. The impact is cyber espionage. Bird 22 notes that governments primarily promote space innovation by issuing contracts to private companies. During space races, China has historically targeted these companies with cyber attacks intended to steal critical information. In fact, Walsh 21 elaborates that China frequently utilizes cyber espionage to steal intellectual property from American-based space companies. This would be detrimental for India's space economy, which Singhai 22 quantifies is currently growing at a rate of 6% every single year. Subpoint B is an oil crisis. In the midst of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Prasricha 22 reports that India's ambiguous foreign policy has allowed India to distinguish itself from Western nations. Subsequently, India maintains a steadfast economic partnership from Russia, particularly in the oil sector. Barcast 22 quantifies that India receives more oil from Russia than any other nation, accounting for 22% of its oil imports. However, Russia's oil exports to India are far from guaranteed. Currently, in response to Western sanctions from the Ukrainian invasion, Reuters 23 reports that Russia is currently cutting overall oil exports by 25% in an effort to raise the price per barrel of its oil. As a result, Pavlov 22 notes that Russia is currently rerouting its oil exports away from Western states and towards neutral actors instead. Moreover, Meredith 23 elaborates that Russia has historically utilized oil as a tool to gain geopolitical leverage, and Russia has already implemented 7 total oil bans on Western nations. In the wake of a Russian oil crisis, India signing the Artemis Accords would signify a diplomatic alignment with the West, providing Russia all the incentive it needs to cut oil exports to India. In fact, Simers 21 reports that Russia has publicly condemned the Artemis Accords, calling them US-centric and colonialistic. The impact is an economic recession in India. On average, Sharma 23 quantifies that Russia offers India oil barrels at prices 733% below average of the market. Subsequently, without imports from Russia, India would be forced to turn to more expensive oil sectors and sources. This would have catastrophic economic consequences, as Day 22 found that in India, a 1% increase in oil prices resulted in a 0.5% increase in the price of goods. Collectively, Cohen 22 explains that India requires cheap Russian oil to sustain its current annual economic growth rate of 7%. Maintaining this rate is a non-negotiable for India, as the United Nations 22 terminalizes that India's growth currently lifts 27 million people out of poverty every single year. Thus we indicate.
Yeah, it's India signing Artemis Accords tells Russia to cut oil. Affirm the resolution. Resolve the Republic of India should sign the Artemis Accords. India has the potential to go big on the space frontier. Route 20 of the Economic Times states, India stands on the cusp of building a space ecosystem, with it being a space hub for the world. This happens in 2 main areas. Subpoint A is India's domestic space sector. Currently, India's space sector is small. Pirzada 20 writes, the Indian space industry is just 2% of the global market. This is why India's current attempts at collaboration are failing. Satyanath 23 explains, India lacks the capacity to advance space collaboration agreements with other countries. Fortunately, signing the Artemis Accords gives it the support it needs in 2 ways. First is by working with other signatories. Mohandas 21 states, as a participant in the Artemis Accords, India can gain lessons from other countries. Takshashila 21 elaborates, participating in the Artemis Accords offers India an opportunity to boost its capacity through co-financing projects and gaining access to critical space technologies. It opens up the possibility of creating supply chains and technology transfers between India and other participating countries. Improving India's space industry improves India's economic growth. Lakshman 20 of the Times of India writes, the Indian space sector could generate hundreds of thousands of jobs. The second way is by boosting the private sector. Signing the Artemis Accords attracts investment to India. Pedagogy 22 states, by being a part of the Accords, India's space companies become part of a global supply chain, helping attract investment capital into India. The reason comes from ERP 21 finding, the Accords provide investors with more certainty as individuals are able to form expectations and plan for future returns on investments. Thus, ERP 21 finalizes, private space investment could double in the next 8 years. Historical precedent proves as Whittington 22 of the Hill States, after joining the Artemis Accords, Nigeria and Rwanda have made themselves more attractive to international investment. The impact is curbing climate change. Biggle 22 of the STPI writes, Indian space startups and satellite manufacturing services play a major role in contributions to climate research. Indeed, Action 21 finds new technologies make it easier to identify emission sources and stop further damage with low carbon alternatives. Preventing climate change is crucial. Lambrana 21 of Bloomberg quantifies climate change is responsible for 5 million deaths globally every year. Subpoint B is displacing Russia. Raj Gopalan 22 of the Carnegie Endowment writes, India's approach to space is driven by national security concerns. Thus, Barua 23 states, a military-industrial ecosystem is taking shape in India. However, India's industry is still in its infancy. Chowdhury 21 finds, India has yet to develop a tiered vendor base, which has prevented the development of a robust industrial base. Luckily, India signing the Artemis Accords greenlights their military industry in 2 ways. First is government investment. India signing the Artemis Accords puts the government's focus on space missions. Parikh 21 explains, the Accords are a prerequisite to join NASA's Artemis program, which could provide a major boost to India's lunar ambitions. Crucially, Bennett's Hawk 22 of the Washington Post finds, national governments play a major role in commercial space activities by providing substantial funding and investing billions of dollars in companies. Government investment in space would focus on the military. Pillai 22 states, India's space program has developed broader utility for the country's military services. Second is sharing standards. David 22 writes, the Artemis program encourages knowledge sharing among partners. Countries can benefit from the knowledge and technological resource base that will come with it and fast-track their own space industry. For these reasons, Mohandas 21 argues that it's essential that India be a participant in the Artemis Accords so that it can gain expertise from other countries. Information sharing is necessary for India's military industry. Banerjee 22 writes, international partners will help India overcome the last hurdle to market access by developing international standards. A strong Indian industry is crucial to displacing Russian arms sales. Banerjee 22 furthers, the Indian industrial complex can produce weapons to reduce reliance on Russian technology. Russian arms sales fuel conflict as Berry 16 continues. Russia sells arms to both Armenia and Azerbaijan, whose military forces face off in a civil war. The parallel arms sales reflect Russia's desire to expand its influence in the strategic region. Without a shift away from Russia, the Council on Foreign Relations 23 concludes, war between Armenia and Azerbaijan has resulted in 30,000 casualties and hundreds of thousands of refugees. Thus we affirm.
Can I see a couple pieces of evidence?
Yeah.
Can I see right now?
Casualties happen.
You'll probably tell me it's during the conflict.
But it talks about like the war that was happening in like the 1900s.
Yeah, that's the article giving context.
Okay, so like, is it happening right
Yes.
now? Okay, you know a question.
Cool. Let's talk about your case.
Yeah.
So if you say India is so important to Russia's oil exports, why would they cut it?
If what?
So you say India is like a big part of Russian oil exports.
No, we say like they're not a big, like even if they are a big part, it's like they're cutting off and moving away from Western nations towards neutral actors.
So who would India's spot be taken by?
I mean, an example, Turkey, China,
Okay.
like they're just moving it down the chain because they're moving
So-
away historically right now,
so-
away from Western actors
right.
towards neutral
Do you have
actors.
any evidence that says China or Turkey is going to amount to as much as India has?
It doesn't, like, our link isn't the amount. We give you like the historical precedent
No, but
that they're moving away,
but
but we
my-
also tell you like Russia's not profiting off the oil right now. They're selling it below market value. So like the profits doesn't even matter. That's not what Russia's prioritizing. They're just prioritizing if it's going to a Western nation or a neutral actor. So that's why when India signs the Artemis Accords and they make this geopolitical shift, then they're going to side towards the West and Russia's going to cut them off and just move further down the chain.
you can have
Okay. So would you agree that India does collaborate with the Quad right now when it comes to space?
why does the Quad matter?
Because if it's happening right now, then what is this change going to happen when you talk about how they're going to work with other signatories? If they're already working with these signatories right now, then what's the
How many
difference?
countries are in the Quad?
That's 4.
Yeah, how many countries are in the Artemis Accords?
How many countries are in the Outer Space Treaty? 117.
Do the Outer Space Treaty, like, countries collaborate
Yes,
on what?
they collaborate on space, but we also tell you that they're collaborating with the
Okay.
Artemis Accord
Tell me
countries as
two-
well.
Tell me 2 outer space countries that through the Outer Space Treaty have like shared intelligence or anything like that.
I mean, I can Google an example if you
Please
want.
do. I would love that.
Okay, you can have a question.
Let's talk about your subpoint A.
Okay.
So you say the Artemis Accords forces India upon the US's agenda.
Mhm.
So does India have other bilateral agreements with the US in space?
The link is the space race. So right now, India's focused domestically on their space, which is why there isn't a space race between China. When they joined the Artemis Accords, a US run like treaty, then obviously that takes them to like an international prioritization, which links into the
Right.
space
What's
race.
uniquely different about a US run treaty and a bilateral agreement between India and the US?
What's the significance of that?
What's the difference? Because if the bilateral agreements already exist,
Yeah,
then they should have the same impact.
because even though they have those bilateral agreements, they're still able to prioritize domestically. When they go towards the Artemis Accords, they have to focus on the US agendas that are set by them because they're the ones who call the shots on the Artemis Accords.
This is a brief off the roadmap. I'm gonna do framework and then go right down my opponent's case. Let's start with some framework. You vote on foreign policy because it's the only impact that has any probability. The Artemis Accords is non-binding. That means it's just a signature on a piece of paper. This signature isn't actually going to inherently do anything. The only impacts that can actually occur is the perception that this signature has. That's why we tell you in our case from Dubin 23, the only actual impact it could have is a geopolitical shift. That's why you prefer our case on strength of link for foreign policy. But then, let's look at their subpoint A about domestic space. First of all, their internal link is that right now, India can't commit to space agreements. Empirically, that's untrue, so you delink the entirety of this subpoint. Y22 explains that since 2021 alone, in the satellite sector alone, India has already signed 6 separate satellite cooperation agreements with foreign countries. Make them prove to you why specifically right now that can't happen. But then, on their link about other signatories, you delink this because their evidence is non-unique to India. This specific card talks about India, but in the actual sentence where it mentions increasing signatories, it just says that as you continue to add signatories, more will happen in the future. There's no uniqueness to India. You don't buy it. But then, even if you don't buy that, you can delink this argument because they don't have any quantification or probability for actually how it's going to link into economic growth. They mentioned that space is a key to economic growth, but they don't tell you how much. They don't tell you what percentage of the economic sector it sounds for. We can't weigh it. But then let's look at their second link about the private sector. Overall, privatization is non-unique for 3 reasons, articulated by Euretia 18. A, it's globally already privatized. 75% of the global private space sector is already commercialized. But then B, the Indian space sector is also already privatizing right now. They're launching a ton of like domestic satellite companies. But C, the link between bilateralism and commercialization is also non-unique. Right now, the Department of Defense and India have already signed agreements. At that point, there's no uniqueness to this argument whatsoever. But even if you don't buy any of that, let's look at their impact. Fifth, you take out this argument because we tell you right now, India has access to the satellite data, but it's still not solving. First of all, the methane tracking satellites that they're talking about, Blackledge 22 explains that they come from the European Space Agency, which means it can never be domestic because it's international technology, which means like unless somehow India gets access to these patents, it will never be domestic. That doesn't make any sense. But even if you buy that, because they already have access to that through their data sharing agreements with the European Space Agency, they already have access to that. But we're not seeing solvency in the status quo because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Because of the invasion, energy prices have skyrocketed. That means it doesn't matter how many satellites we have, it doesn't matter how many, like if you can identify the sources, because energy prices are so expensive, there's no actual solvency. Thus, despite having this data, India is still not even close to meeting the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius. You take out this argument, it's really a stretch. But then, on their subpoint A about Russia, you don't buy any of their warranting because their impact is totally ridiculous. We called for their piece of evidence, and it's 30,000 lives from the Nagorno-Karabakh war. That happened in the 1990s. It's not happening anymore. This argument makes no sense whatsoever. But then, let's take a look at their individual warranting. On their first point about government investment, they're misconstruing their evidence really poorly. poorly. First of all, we called for the card that explains that government investment links into the military-industrial complex, but their evidence doesn't explicitly say that. It just says that in the status quo, governments are a large part of space funding. But again, we tell you that's not unique because of privatization. India is already privatized, which means that naturally there's going to be more government contacts towards private companies. There's no solvency, there's no uniqueness. But then, on their last point about sharing standards, this is also totally not unique, just like the rest of their case. The Outer Space Treaty already has provisions for sharing technology. But then, Manuel gets up across and says, give 2 examples. Well, even if you do buy the argument the Outer Space Treaty fails, that empirically proves that treaties don't work at doing anything but ticking people off. This is really important because the multilateral treaty, which is the Outer Space Treaty, which is legally binding, if that didn't work, then the Artemis Accords could never work because they're not legally binding, they're not brokered through international Tucson, and it's just US centrism, it's just the United States trying to control what everyone does in space. But then, even if you don't buy any of that, you turn this entire argument against them again because globalization is terrible for Indian space companies. In the status quo, Shanghai 22 quantifies that the Indian space sector is growing at 6% every single year. However, if you have interoperability, that means you're using global infrastructure standards. And who leads those standards? The United States. That means all domestic production is cut off and it's clouded out by these interoperability and the United States. You vote for what's working right now, the space sector is growing. Vote on probability, vote con.
I have a little bit of an illness, so I might be a little short. Is anyone not ready? I'll start my time right now. This foreign policy framework is pretty silly. Our arguments are also foreign policy. Cooperation comes from governments. Those have foreign policies. Plus, private sectors also have perceptions. Obviously, all of our arguments are linking to their framing. I don't know why they read it. Let's go to our subpoint A. They say cooperation is high right now. It can always be higher. India only accounts for 2% of the sector. It can always increase. Then they say there's no link to it in India specifically for working with other signatories. Our argument is not that we're going to bring in other countries. It's that India can work with the countries that are already in the Artemis Accords. It's not about bringing other people in. We don't need that link. Then they say, how many jobs will it create? Our evidence for Shamoon finds in 22 that it'll create millions of jobs per the space sector. That's our impact. Let's go to boosting the private sector. You can group their first 2 responses. Even if privatization is high right now, it can always get higher. 75% is global, not in India. Our evidence indicates there's only a few hundred private companies for space in India. That's how we link to our impact. Then they say the DoD already signed agreements. This is literally a concession of their entire case. If the Department of Defense is already signing agreements with India in space sectors, there's no reason why uniquely the Artemis Accords escalates tensions. They don't give you that in case. It's way too late. Let's go to satellites. Our impact is not about satellites. It's about new climate tech. In fact, it circumvents their own response because it's about low carbon technology that gets rid of things like oil. Let's go to government investment. They say they're already privatized. That's fine. And they ask why is it about private money? Our evidence indicates that private companies for space also do military purposes. That means when you invest in a space company, you also increase its military capacity. They say the OSD failed. This is a very unnuanced idea of how the OSD actually worked. It was just a treaty about not mining the moon. The Artemis Accords is completely different. It calls for things like cooperation. Then they say that we're going to crowd out India's sector. There's absolutely no warrant given here at all. India has is cheaper labor. If anything, we're going to increase their sector. Then they say our evidence is about the 1990s. That's just an example. Our card overall indicates that they do arms sales for foreign policy, which is why Dooley in 21 finds they do the same thing in the Middle East right now in Saudi Arabia. Let's go to their case. On geopolitics, they say the OSD is the best basis for space. The OSD literally did nothing. It was just an agreement that said, oh, overall, we don't want to mine space. That's not actually getting anyone to do anything. That's why our stern evidence finds that even if you have the OSD, the Artemis Accords are not violating it. They're not a law. They're not trying to be international law. They are just a bunch of countries coming together and saying, hey, we should do these things. They don't violate the OSD and they don't give you any reason why they do. Then let's go to their first link on space competition. Actually, go to both of them. We would say that India doesn't actually have to increase any sort of conflict or escalation with these countries when they sign the Artemis Accords. Our Rebuttal evidence in 23 finds that India can sign the Artemis Accords while also working with other actors like Russia and China. It's not mutually exclusive. This is historically proven. It's a non-binding treaty, and Nigeria just signed a new contract and launched a new satellite to space with China 3 days ago, even though they're members of the Artemis Accords. Furthermore, we would say if anything, bringing new countries into the Artemis Accords changes it away from being a US-centric policy. Our Howell evidence finds that when India joins, they're another major spacefaring nation, which means the Accords become multilateral, India plus the US, not just the US. And insofar as they say India is so great with China and Russia, that obviously makes them like the alliance more. Then we would say, if anything, we reduce all of the risks of their impacts because our many evidence finds that transparency is required by the Artemis Accords. So even if China and Russia are our enemies, either way, they know what we're doing, which means they're less likely to escalate. Let's go to their argument on space competition in China. This doesn't happen. Our Rebuttal evidence in 21 finds that China and Russia have really, really bad relations, and we've never seen their argument even once. Plus, we would find for the key evidence that China can't afford a war. It would hurt all of the regional alliances in Asia because India is in Asia and they want global domination. Finally, we would say our arm rating evidence finds that the economic deterioration from these things hurts China as much as it hurts the US because of international linkages. Let's go to Russia. Their argument is completely missing how a transactional arrangement works. Our Pashta evidence finds that India has increased its oil, but because Russia gave it a discounted price because they need the oil to fund the war effort. Our Sharma evidence finds that India is the only thing keeping Russia's oil balance afloat. Their evidence that said they can go to other places is talking about going to India. There is no other countries that can buy all this oil. They simply can't fill in. Finally, our DOM evidence in 20 finds that Saudi Arabia always undercuts prices when Russia pulls out in order to gain market share, which means either way, India will get access to this oil. We're going to run a little bit of prep time.
I'm good. Judges ready? Let's take a look at your first impact about climate. Sure. What's the solvency? What are these alternative technologies that we're seeing?
Low carbon technologies.
What does that mean?
Low carbon technologies, helium-3.
Helium-3 from the moon?
Sure.
Helium-3 is not technology, that's an element. What
That's
like
technology? Burning helium-3 to create energy is a technology.
Sure, so like
wait, really quickly. Our argument is about new innovative technologies. How am I supposed to know what the technology is?
right. So if you don't know what it is and you don't know what it does, then how do you access your solvency?
If I knew what it was, then we wouldn't be running.
So you're
our
running an
economy on
impact
gas.
about something that you don't even know what it is.
No, I know what it is. It's innovation that creates low carbon technology.
What does that mean?
Wait,
That means
you're asking me
nothing.
to give you a technology that would
Well, the reason why
redefine
it's
the world
important
economy
It's
How?
because the innovation that you're talking about right now is methane satellites, right? That's the
It's just
only
not.
low.
You could just assert that our evidence is literally not about that.
No, you don't know what your evidence is about.
I do.
You
It's
just
low
said
carbon alternative. How is a methane
All right.
satellite a low
It's
carbon
okay.
alternative?
It's all right. You have a question.
All right, let's talk about your argument on Russia, right? So it has Nigeria and Rwanda joined the Artemis Accords. Did Russia cut oil to them?
Sure. So the difference is Russia doesn't give a crap about Nigeria and Rwanda. India and China are in the midst of a big regional power competition, which is why specifically India making a geopolitical shift matters, whereas Nigeria and Rwanda doesn't. But can I get a question?
Wait, so that's not responsive to Russia.
Sure. So Russia doesn't care about Rwanda and Nigeria, right?
Why not?
Because they're not large geopolitical threats.
Nigeria is.
Nigeria is a threat to Russia?
Yeah,
Do you have
Nigeria is
a
the
piece of
largest
evidence that
economy
says that?
I mean, I think it's pretty intuitive. I can find
You think
one.
it's intuitive that Nigeria is comparable to Russia?
Nigeria is the largest economy in Africa and the largest military.
In Africa, sure, but we're talking about Russia, one of the, okay. Let me get a question.
You can have a question.
So right now, are Russian arms sales leading to any conflict in the status quo?
Syria. Our evidence indicates it's across the Middle East. Like our example in Armenia.
But your
Azerbaijan,
evidence is from the Caucasus region.
That's one piece of evidence.
No, it's your only quantifiable and terminalized impact.
That's not okay. The only quantifiable impact, I'll agree with that. But either way, they're escalating war in these countries that kills people.
Sure, what wars right now are being escalated?
Syria.
And do you have a quantification about the specific impact of Russian arms in Syria?
The war has killed hundreds of thousands.
And
I don't think I
every gun in the
okay.
war came from Russia?
Riddle me this. How much do you decrease oil?
How much do we, right? So we're using empirical precedents. Right now, there's 7 complete oil embargoes from Russia on Western countries. So you increase it 100%.
Wait, those oil embargoes are in countries that sanctioned them. Is
Right.
India
So
sanctioning them?
actually, they're not in response to sanctions. They're in response to price caps. But the reason that
Those are
our card
sanctions.
articulates, right? But our card specifically articulates that the reason why they're implementing the sanctions is as a symbolic gesture against the West. That's why our due evidence is really, really clear. When you lead to this geopolitical shift and India becomes part of the West,
How does
that's why
India
Russia
become
would do
the
this.
West? They signed an Artemis Accords paper. You say they're already cooperating with the DOD.
Sure. So the reason is because in the status quo, their policy is ambiguous, even if they have like select niche instances of cooperation. But when you sign a huge treaty like the Artemis Accords, you're signifying overall that you're getting rid of that ambiguity and going with the West.
All right, that's not cool.
Okay, we are going to go ahead and run neg F. Everybody all good? Perfect. Started with Luke and I's sole contention about geopolitics. They give a few responses. They said the Outer Space Treaty did nothing, that the Artemis Accords doesn't violate it. But they dropped the evidence we read you in case from Cross 23 that the Artemis Accords are sponsored by the US. That's why they violate, because the Outer Space Treaty was an international entity. Because it's run by the US, that's why it violates, because that's the geopolitical shift that happens. Next, they say that India's going to sign the Artemis Accords and it can still work with other countries. Their evidence for this is one country that's not India. They dropped the significance of India in the status quo. Right now, they're a swing state, which is why they're significant. But when they sign the Artemis Artemis Accords, they send their space towards the US away from this strategic ambiguity, which literally leads to this geopolitical switch that we give them the Dubin 23 evidence and they don't counter with it. That says that the Artemis Accords directly destroys this ambiguity, which is a geopolitical shift that links into our impacts. They say that India is multilateral with the Artemis Accords, but the Artemis Accords are bilateral in the sense that it's other countries working with the US. It's US run, US calls the shots. The Outer Space Treaty is better. But also they just talk about how this transparency argument, but our impacts outweigh, specifically with oil, which is what we're going for. They just say that we're going to increase oil with India. But remember that Russia's cutting off oil and moving towards neutral actors. We give you this evidence from Reuters 23 that they're cutting oil exports 25% to increase the price in response to Western sanctions, thus so they can increase it per barrel. Also, Russia's not profiting off their oil. They're selling it at a net negative. But third, we have historical precedent. We give you this evidence which tells you that Russia's moving their oil away from Western nations towards neutral actors. Of course, our evidence talks about India because right now India is a neutral actor. But when they give this geopolitical shift, they sign the Artemis Accords from Dubin 23, which they dropped. That makes the shift. That links into our impacts. That leads into our impacts. Cohen 22 tells you that cheap Russian oil is needed to sustain India's economic growth by 7%. Point blank. Thus, the only way that they can sustain this economic growth is by purchasing this cheap oil, which lifts 27 million people out of poverty every single year. That's the biggest impact in today's round, but also we win on probability because it's happening right now. The second they sign the Artemis Accords, they get cut off. Russia just moves further down the line. But now onto their case. Their first contention about domestic, but you de-link this because remember in 2021, India signed six separate satellite agreements. Collaboration isn't unique. They just say that there can always be more, but they don't quantification what this more is going to be. But also we tell you that there's no term of this economic growth. Remember, they say that there's millions of jobs. They don't tell us how many jobs. Judges, how am I supposed to weigh in today's round? But also remember that space privatization is non-unique. They just respond by saying that it could be more. How much more? It's not unique, thus it's not going to change. But also on their impacts, they don't even know what this tech is. So why would you even vote on it? But also they say that they can solve for oil with this tech, but they don't know what the tech is. They don't give us probability. They don't tell us a percentage or anything. They just say that, oh, we solve, but we solve better with our poverty impacts. And also we went on historical precedent. Contention two, they talk about Russia. Don't even boast because look at their impact. It's from 1990s. They say, oh, this is an example. That example's from the 1990s before the Artemis Accords were even created. But also they drop our term, which tells you that when the India joins the Artemis Accords, that means that they're going to be crowded out by the US.
Anyone not ready? On the overall responses on their case, first, our Rebuttal evidence is amazing. Our Rebuttal evidence is specific to India, and it finds that India can, even if they join the Artemis Accords, work with other countries similar to Nigeria. Nigeria is a really good example. They just say Russia doesn't care about Nigeria, but Nigeria is a massive country in Africa, and it's the largest economy in the region and largest military. It definitely has strategic influence. They respond with their Dubin evidence. Their Dubin evidence says nothing about a geopolitical switch to India. This evidence is ridiculously bad. They go for their second link on oil prices, but there's so many problems. The evidence they show us just says, the evidence says in some cases they lowered the price. It's not even overall saying price was lowered. But B, the most important response comes fully conceded out of summary, and it's that Saudi Arabia undercuts prices anyway, so India's economy never suffers because they just go to Saudi Arabia to get the oil in the first place because they undercut prices. I'll get to it. On our case, at the top of our contention one, they only have one response in our entire private sector link, and it's that how much. We give you the ERP evidence in case, and they call for a 2. It's a 2 times increase in space investment. Extend the argument. Pedagogy 22 writes that the Artemis Accords bring investment capital into India because it makes investors have confidence in the Indian sector because it reaffirms their positions on resource extraction. That's really good because when you increase investment, it allows more companies to happen, which allows more companies to invest in climate research, which is really good because those new climate technologies can help decrease climate change, which kills 5 million a year. They just say what technology? It doesn't exist yet. I don't know what you want me to say. On our subpoint B about displacing Russia, in the last 10 seconds of their speech, they read one response, and instead our impact evidence is about Armenia and Azerbaijan, but they miss what Julian says in rebuttal. That evidence is just empiric to say what has happened historically. If you look to now, it's in regions like the Middle East, all over the world. The reason also their turn was fully overtime, I'm not even going to respond to it. On the weighing, our argument outweighs for 3 reasons. First is on lives. Our impact is to deaths, which is irreversible, unlike poverty. Second, on scope, our impact of arms sales is about like a bunch of different countries and regions where arms sales interact rather than just India. And third, Economic collapse happens in civil wars, which are funded by arms sales. So if arms sales increase to regions, it probably just hurts the economies of those regions and strategic regions like the Middle East. Now to extend our subpoint B about displacing Russia. Raj Goplan of the Economic Times in 2020 states that India's approach to space is driven by national security concerns. That's really good because now when they increase investment in their space sector, they also increase investment in their military sector because it's the same companies that do those. That's really good because when you increase investment in the space sector, it increases their production of arms and other types of weapons, which allows India to displace Russia in terms of arms sales. The reason Russian arms sales are specifically bad is because they want strategic influence in the region, so they sell arms to both sides of the conflict. Because they sell arms to both sides of the conflict, it prolongs it, which is really bad. That's why in Armenia, for example, when they prolong the conflict, it caused 30,000 deaths and 700,000 refugees. Even if you don't like that, in fact, our Middle East one from Rebuttal is still there.
So when we talk about like overall looking at this oil crisis, if Russia is decreasing and moving their oil away from the West towards neutral actors, then why wouldn't they move it also away from India?
India is the neutral actor they look to.
Right now, right?
Wait, but it's not like there's just infinite neutral countries in the world. India has 1.5 billion people. They're getting the vast majority.
So I would say the only like not really neutral countries right now are NATO, Russia, and China. So a majority of countries are neutral, and a majority of countries need oil.
Wait, a majority of that doesn't matter. You yourself tell me that India is super important to Russia.
Right.
Our evidence indicates they have the vast majority of Russian oil. Like there aren't that many countries that can buy Russian oil if they like name me one other that's not.
The
China.
majority is 22%. It's not like it's like above 50%.
Wait, name me one other that's not China
From what?
that can buy Russian oil.
I told you that they're moving it to Turkey and to
Turkey has
China.
like 100 million people. They're not going
I
to
gave
get
you that.
2 billion people.
I gave you
oil.
that in first cross
Look,
when you asked for the
So
example.
again, here's the
Yeah.
thing. Right now, because Russian oil is so cheap and because they're selling at a net negative, they don't really care about the money coming from the oil.
Wait.
But additionally, you drop the analysis, we tell you that the reason why they're cutting it is to increase the overall price per barrel on the market.
No,
At
wait,
that
what?
point, we tell you that Russia doesn't really care about the economic impact. They care about the symbolic message.
Wait,
Message.
the
That's what our
does
evidence
not
says.
say they're selling at a net negative. It says some oil producers are selling oil that costs less or costs more than it makes for them to produce.
Yeah.
Yes. So some people are losing money. Overall,
Yeah.
our evidence indicates it's the only thing keeping the Russian economy afloat.
I guarantee your evidence does not say that.
But
But
I'd
also,
love to
like
see
I
it.
told you, we gave you the
Sure.
733% terminalization. But overall, you're underlooking the importance of India as it's strategically ambiguous. That's like you compare them to like other countries like Nigeria, but you're underlooking the significance of India and how they're not like moving towards the US or towards Russia or China.
What does that mean? If they sign the Artemis Accords, why do they lose their foreign policy of strategic ambiguity?
Sure, because their foreign policy right now, specifically their space policy, is one of ambiguity. If you sign an alliance with a whole bunch of Western countries, that
It's
is
not an
not
alliance.
ambiguity.
It's not an alliance though. It says,
Okay,
hey, we
like
agree
treaty,
to-
whatever
Yeah.
you want to call it. If you
The
sign
difference-
anything with 20 Western countries,
difference
it's
is-
not
Wait,
ambiguous.
They signed the Quad that has 3 Western countries.
Sure, so that's 3, but again, the Quad is not a dictation of the nation's entire space policy, whereas the Artemis Accords
You're right. It's
would
a
be.
dictation of their military
But
policy, which is
also-
a lot more
yeah,
important for their
They're
strategic
collaborating
ambiguity.
with the Quad and with other countries in Artemis. So the fact that they have to sign an agreement to like it like leads to this shift
So they're
and leads to that
Already
difference.
cooperating. The fact that they have to sign a non-binding treaty all of a sudden makes them get rid of their entire foreign policy, and Russia cuts all their oil system.
Yes, because if they're already collaborating, then why do they have to sign the treaty?
Yeah,
That's what
why?
the, like
Why does
that's
it
why we
matter?
tell you in our framework that you're voting
I'm
on like this
Russia.
sign.
If they're already collaborating, why do they have to sign an agreement for me to be mad?
Because why would they have to sign the agreement to make the change if it's already happening?
How much prep time do we have left? This is a brief off-time roadmap. I'm going to go over the neg case in way, and then I'm going to go over the app case in way. The only real response that our opponents extend at the top of our link about geopolitics is Nigeria. But again, Russia doesn't care about Nigeria. I think we can all agree that. They drop the heart of our warranting in every single speech, which is the Dubin 23 evidence. They say this evidence is bad, but I implore you to call for it. It specifically articulates that India is strategically significant in the geopolitical context of the Indo-Pacific, which is why they are single-handedly the most important actor that has not yet joined the Artemis Accords. That's how we have a unique geopolitical shift. They never respond to this. But specifically, on our subpoint B, their responses are really, really bad. Specifically, they never respond to the Reuters 23 evidence that we read in case that explains the reason why Russia's cutting oil right now is to increase the price per barrel by getting rid of the overall amount on the market. At that point, they are looking for excuses to cut oil. They never respond to that, so we have clean access. Specifically, we also tell you from Meredith 23 that they are symbolically rerouting oil away from Western countries. At that point, we tell you again, because overall their economy isn't oil-based right now, they only care about the geopolitical message that it sends. That's what our evidence says. They never call for it, they never respond to it. We have clean access to our impact. Specifically, we tell you from Cohen 22 that cheap Russian oil accounts for 7% of current GDP growth, which is crucial because that alone lifts 27 million individuals out of poverty every single year. Here's why our impacts are better. A, on probability, they're happening right now, but additionally, ours compact and grow exponentially over time as poverty continues to go down, as the population grows up, whereas theirs are like reversible. But then let's look at their side of the flow. On their first point about domestic space, they drop the evidence from White 22 that explains inherently there's nothing about the Artemis Accords that has a uniqueness for space cooperation. We tell you there's agreements. They tell you there can be more, but they don't quantify how much. At that point, we can't weigh anything. But additionally, their only evidence that talks about the private sector increasing is this double in the next 8 years card. But again, that doesn't respond to our evidence that explains that right now a majority of the space sector is already privatized. That's why their evidence doesn't mention space number 1 and doesn't mention the Artemis Accords number 2. But even if you buy the entirety of their link chain, you don't vote on their impact because they don't even know what technology they're talking about. They have no probability. It's totally ridiculous. Climate change is irreversible. But lastly, on their entire point about Russia, I don't care if you buy the entirety of the link chain. Their impact is absolutely preposterous. It's 30,000 people from the 1990s. They haven't given you a single example of a life law from Russian arms sales in the status quo. Vote probability, vote con.
There's going to be fine. Great. So you know, ready? I'll start my time right now. There are two really important responses to their case, none of which are actually responded to. The first is the Upadawa evidence in 23. Upadawa isn't talking about Nigeria. That's the example we give. Upadawa says India can sign the Artemis Accords and also work with Russia and China because it's a non-binding agreement. They just disagree. They just disregard that this exists in every single speech. Argument is not that Nigeria is the example. It's that our evidence finds specifically that it's a non-binding treaty and won't cause the change they talk about. The problem with their Dubin evidence is not that it says India is important. It's that it doesn't say that them signing the Artemis Accords would hurt their geopolitical standing at all. The Artemis Accords is a non-binding treaty. That's why our Upadawa evidence finds they can still sign it and still be strategically ambiguous. Nothing changes. The second most important response is the Dom evidence in 20. If you don't want to vote for their case, just write this word down on your ballot. It's talking about Saudi Arabia. It finds that even if we cut oil from Russia to India, Saudi Arabia always increases its production and decreases prices, which means India still has access to oil. Russia can cut its oil, and at the end of the day, Brooke and Luke have conceded that it doesn't matter for India. Saudi Arabia sells it to the Americans. Let's go to our case. You can vote for us in two ways. First is boosting the private sector. Our pedagogy evidence finds the Artemis Accords bring investment capital to India because they give investor confidence about India's role on resource extraction. That's great because it funds new space startups, which our Rebuttal evidence finds helps with new technologies that reduce carbon and at the end of the day have low carbon alternatives that solve climate change. Otherwise, it's killed 5 million people per year. They just say they're already privatized. A, this response was not in summary, but B, we say it increases 2 times. That means either way, we have way more technology. Then they say we don't know the technology. Obviously, it's new technology. If it already existed, we wouldn't have a problem with climate change. Let's go to our subpoint B. We can extend this as well. We say the government gets interested in these space programs. Actually, just extend the private sector link. When we invest more in private sector, this leads to an increase in space programs that also do military. That's really good because it increases India's arms sales. Our energy evidence finds it displaces Russian arms sales. Russian arms sales fund both sides of the conflict, and this causes war in places like the Middle East. Their only response is it's about Armenia and Azerbaijan. They've conceded that it has other examples. At the end of the day, their probability weighing is really bad. It didn't happen in Nigeria, whereas they've conceded our weighing that on scope, civil wars, and climate change cause economic downturn, which prereqs their case. They're going to affirm.